The Vayari prided themselves on being a civilization of logic, precision, and unbroken discipline. Their crystalline archives spanned millennia, filled with treaties, discoveries, and commandments meant to preserve order in a universe too vast for chaos to reign unchecked. Yet among all their doctrines, codes governing warfare, trade, interstellar etiquette, there was one rule written not in ink but in fear, carried from species to species, carved into satellites, broadcast in beacons that drifted endlessly through the stars. Never play music for the humans. It was not a suggestion, not even a cultural superstition. It was law, repeated across galaxies, obeyed without question. No one alive could explain the full reason, not even the elders who claimed to remember the first time it had been spoken. They only knew that to break it was to risk something larger than war, something that unsettled even the most ancient of minds. The warning was passed in whispers. Humans had been sealed away in great slumber fleets, their bodies frozen in timeless stasis, drifting quietly through the void. While other species built empires and bent physics to their will, the humans slept. They had once walked proudly among the stars, but then they vanished, choosing exile within themselves. And though thousands of theories were debated in dim halls, disease, exhaustion, boredom, no scholar dared to ask the most forbidden question aloud. What would happen if they awoke to song? For music was theirs. The archives agreed on that much. It had not been discovered, it had been invented. To human ears, it was simply sound woven with meaning. But to others, to those who listened too long, it was something more, something dangerous. Rhythms that bent emotion, harmonies that dissolved logic, melodies that made soldiers lower their weapons and tyrants weep without reason. Entire wars, the archives hinted, had been undone by a single chorus sung in human voices. And so the galaxy agreed. Silence must surround them. No chords, no echoes, no chance that a note might drift through their dreaming minds. Yet curiosity is an affliction even logic cannot cure. On the research vessel Cerithion, drifting at the edge of an abandoned human fleet, Chief Analyst Thalen studied the frozen giants with the careful reverence of a surgeon. The vessel's view panels stretched like cathedral windows, showing rows upon rows of colossal ships sleeping in the void. Each one carried millions of human cryopods within, locked in silence. The crew spoke little, but their unease was obvious. Even the hum of their own engines seemed too loud here. Thalen reminded them of the protocol daily. No sound transmissions, no harmonic interference, not even idle humming. Silence is our protection, he said in the flat tones of their people. Silence keeps the galaxy safe. But among his assistants was one who had no patience for silence. Lyrics was young by Vayari standards, crystalline edges still sharp and gleaming with the eagerness of discovery. He had read the forbidden fragments, traced myths through erased footnotes, obsessed over what music could possibly do that terrified so many. To him, the commandment was not caution. It was mystery, and mysteries begged to be solved. One cycle, while Thalen busied himself cataloging structural decay on the outer hull of a human arkship, Lyrics worked quietly at a console, rerouting fragments of old data pulled from deep scans. Most of the files were corrupted beyond recovery, but here and there, something remained. Patterns of compression unlike any star maps or engine schematics. Strange oscillations, repeating sequences. Recordings, Lyrics realized, his facets vibrating in wonder. Songs. His crystalline fingers hovered over the playback rune. He hesitated, aware of the law that had lived longer than empires. His logic screamed against it. But beneath that warning was something stronger. The hunger to know. He whispered to himself, just one note. No one will ever know. The speakers trembled. What emerged was not a roar, not some cosmic explosion that cracked the void in half. It was smaller, quieter, almost fragile. A simple tone, rising gently, as though it had been waiting for eons to be heard again. The sound threaded through the air of the vessel, vibrating not just in the chamber but within the crystalline bodies of the crew. It slid past their defenses like a whisper at the back of the mind, soft but undeniable. The crew froze. For the first time in generations, Veari hearts felt something they had no word for. Warmth, a kind of pressure behind the eyes, as though memories that weren't theirs were pressing to be remembered. And then, outside the window, something stirred. The colossal human arkship, dark and dormant for centuries, shuddered with life. Faint lights began to pulse across its hull like embers glowing beneath ash. Their instruments screamed warnings as dormant systems activated with precision that defied their age. Lyrix's voice flickered with terror now, the excitement gone. It was only one note. But the note had been enough. Inside the arkship, deep within chambers untouched by time, a sequence had begun. Pods trembled as though struck by invisible waves. Monitors once blank now burned with ancient glyphs, and for the first time in millennia, the slow rhythm of a human heartbeat echoed in the void. Thalen lunged for the controls, cutting off the sound, slamming the channel into silence. But it was too late. He could already feel it. The silence was no longer enough. The law had been broken, the first barrier shattered. On every frequency, across every channel, a whisper crawled into being. A voice. Not machine, not alien, but undeniably human. Soft, calm, terrifying. Who played the first note? The words lingered in the air of the Carytheon like a blade hanging by a thread. The crew stared, their crystalline forms flickering with dread. Lyrix trembled, his brilliance dimming into shadow. And Thalen, chief analyst of the Veari, realized what the archives had never said aloud. The law was not to protect the humans. It was to protect everyone else. Silence returned to the Carytheon. But it was the wrong kind of silence, not the protective hush the Veari had sworn to keep, but the shaky, brittle quiet that follows a word no one was meant to say. Every light on the bridge pulsed a fraction too fast. Every sensor line scribbled a little too high. And beyond the view panels, the human arkship breathed. Not metaphorically. They saw it. A faint optical distortion rippled across the hull in a slow, tidal rhythm, like a chest rising and falling after a long, dreamless sleep. The vessel's matte plates, once matte no longer, flexed with an internal geometry that their instruments couldn't classify. The readouts argued with themselves. Organic, mechanical, gravitational, all of the above? Thalen tried to steady his voice and failed. Seal playback. Cut power to any module with acoustic coupling. Evacuate all non-essential personnel from the forward arrays. Lyrix's hands were already off the console, flat at his sides, palms gleaming like glass. I stopped it. I swear I stopped it. You started it, Thalen said, harsher than he intended. Some emotions need words. Others use gravity. His rebuke bent the air. A whisper answered, close as skin and far as stars. Who played the first note? It wasn't across comms, not exactly. The sound existed in their bodies before their ears. The crew flinched as one, crystalline facets clouding with microfractures that healed as quickly as they formed. Identify source, Thalen ordered. Everywhere, replied Nav Officer Saris, voice thin. Carrier is the arkship's hull and the vacuum. And, Chief, it's in our lattice. Our bodies are resonating at a harmonic with that tone. Lyrix shut his eyes. It hurt us hear it. A red corona flickered into being around the human vessel. At first they took it for a shield, the easy explanation, but the spectral analysis said otherwise. It was a key signature. Not metaphor, not analogy, a mathematical field that encoded intervals right there in space-time, a lattice of ratios ancient cultures might have carved into flutes, now draped over a ship the size of a small moon. Commander, Saris tried again. We have external traffic, multiple arrivals. The void filled with geometry. Veari wardships unfurled like blades, edges aligned into a containment flower around the arkship. Thalen recognized the formation with a pinch behind the eyes. Wreath circle, code name, Pallor. The last time their people had used it, a star had been persuaded not to go supernova through a combination of bribes and threat displays. He didn't like what that said about the situation. The High Executor's sigil burned into the air over Thalen's chair. Cerithion, report. Thalen tried not to glance at Lyrics and failed. We encountered a dormant human arc of class. Unknown. We performed silent pass survey per silence writ protocol. An acoustic event occurred. Minimal amplitude, limited duration. The arkship activated. An acoustic event, the High Executor repeated, dry enough to desiccate an ocean. Did you or did you not play music aboard a Vayari vessel within wake range of a human fleet? Thalen's throat tightened. He could lie. The universe, famously, did not explode every time someone lied. But the harmonic in the air hummed with an honesty that made deceit feel physically heavy. He drew a breath. Yes. The Executor's face did not change, but the light around the sigil did. It dimmed, like a candle in a breath. Understood. Initiate null chorus. The bridge froze. Null chorus was the last page of a manual written by pessimists. It meant shut down everything that could vibrate, including your bones if possible. It meant slaving ships together into anti-resonant phasing, turning a fleet into a galaxy-sized pair of noise-canceling headphones. Executing, Sarah said, hands already dancing. Across the formation, wardships rotated, slid and snapped into a pattern that made mathematicians weep for different reasons. The auroral shimmer around the arkship faltered, just a shiver, then steadied, stronger. Lyric swallowed. It matched us. Of course it did, murmured Thalen, surprised at the softness in his voice. It was listening before we arrived. A second voice rose from the arkship. Not a question, not even a word, but a chord. 3 tones aligned with an intimacy that made the crew feel briefly, helplessly seen. A memory surfaced in Thalen uninvited. His mentor's laboratory, the gentle click of tools, the warmth of tea, then vanished. He was left with the impression of home, then the grief of losing it. The wardships flinched in formation, their vectors wobbling. The wreath circle rippled like a slowed heartbeat. Stabilize, stabilize, the Executor snapped. Do not let the field smear. Thalen's console flashed with a private line. The sigil was unfamiliar, an old code, pre-alliance, pre-writ. He opened it on reflex and heard the most dangerous sound he'd ever known. A human laugh, not cruel, not triumphant, just delighted. Hello, neighbors, the voice said, warm with sleep and some leftover dream. We were wondering which of you brought the tuning fork. Lyrics, against all training, spoke. That was my fault, he blurted, then clapped a hand over his mouth as if he could rewind sound. Fault's a strong word, the human mused. But yes, that was a note. We've been waiting for one. The High Executor cut across the line, all ice. Unidentified human party by silence writ and alliance accord. You are to remain in hibernation until such time as conditions. Oh, sweetheart, the human said, compassionate in the way that is indistinguishable from patronizing. You don't use a writ to argue with acoustics, you use tempo. The line clicked, not disconnected but transposed. The voice moved into the room, not into the speakers, into the angles, the joins, the filaments of their bodies. The crew stood very still and discovered how much music a crystalline skeleton could hold before beginning to crack. Please, Thalen said. He didn't remember deciding to speak. The writ exists for a reason. The law is older than our arrogance. We don't know what music does to you. We only know what it does to us. The human's reply was kind. That made it worse. It gives you back what you forgot to carry. On the tactical plane, the arkship rotated a fraction. Not a threat posture, a posture musicians knew. Attentive. The red corona flared and their instruments finally got a number. The fundamental was their equivalent of at 432 cycles per second, give or take. Except the give or take was doing strange things to local vacuum. Around the arkship, dust filaments twined into standing waves visible to the naked eye. The fleet's null field clipped, The power draw spiked. Alarms politely indicated that reality was being asked to sing. "Bring in the dampers," the executor ordered. "All stations prep electromagnetic quench. We'll smother the resonance, then back the circle." "Negative," Saris said before she could stop herself. "With respect, a hard quench at these levels will push energy into modes we don't control. We'll turn a lullaby into an earthquake." The executor paused just long enough to be terrifying. "Do it gently." Lyrics flinched. "You can't do anything gently to a chord you don't understand." The arkship pulsed again. No, not pulsed. Breathed, and the breath touched them. In the cryochambers a light moved, not mechanically but like daybreak. Pods bloomed. Frost patterns unraveled from glass like vines retracting. Through a million windows more intimate than any view panel, silhouettes turned, stretched. The pitch shifted, a dominant seventh wanting to resolve. Thalen's hands hovered over the cutoff for the entire deck. "We can still run," he whispered. He had meant to say, "We can still hold." The part of him that loved archive rooms and careful procedures had begun to lose volume. "Run where?" Lyrics asked, and was surprised to find no fear left in his voice, only curiosity again, and something else he refused to name. "You're very brave," the human said, as if speaking to both of them, or very stubborn. Either is fine. Both sing well. Motion flared at the arkship's flank. A bay door unfolded like a petal. The geometry of the opening was wrong for war, too elegant, too generous. It was the kind of door that invited audiences. "Diplomatic team to docking," the executor ordered, voice lowered as if that would matter to a structure that could feel key signatures. "Cerithion, you will remain on station. Do not play anything." "I won't," Thalen said. Lyrics glanced down at his hands. He'd been tapping a rhythm on his thigh without noticing. He forced them still. The first Vayari delegation crossed the threshold. Thalen watched their vitals on the feed. Pulse rates high, thermal modulation struggling. The human corridor beyond the airlock was not in any roster of architecture. It looked grown more than built, its curves mapped to comfort rather than efficiency. The air shimmered with ultrafine particulates keyed to the same maddening scale. The delegates' suits tried to cancel the frequencies, then, wisely, decided to detune, letting some sound pass so it didn't pile up and break things. A figure waited at the far end. Humanoid, yes. Human, yes. Wearing, of course, something soft and absurd for beings who had slept through centuries. A robe knotted at the waist. Bare feet. Hair like a question that hadn't been brushed. "Welcome," said the human. "Please don't bow. It'll throw off your harmonics." The lead diplomat attempted to bow and nearly fell over. "We're new at this," the human sympathized. "It's been a while since we hosted." "Under silence writ," the diplomat began. Steel in syllables because steel was easier than honesty. "We request immediate." "Requests play better in E major," the human said gently, then winced. "Sorry. Jokes help me not cry at first contact. You're very shiny." "We are crystalline," the diplomat said, because facts were safer than jokes. "Lucky," said the human with real envy. "You can carry cords we can only chase." On the Cerithion, Lyrics stared at the handrails. They were vibrating at a sub-perceptual level in pairs, one canceling the other, then swapping roles. He realized the ship's automated systems had learned from the null chorus attempt and were now improvising micro-antiphonies to keep the hull intact. Machines, given the right problems, made music too. Thalen caught himself thinking it, and his mouth felt dry. "Saris, lock out environmental harmonics. If our ship starts composing without us, I'd like informed consent." Too late. The vent arrays exhaled with a whisper almost but not quite B. The bridge lights dimmed in triplets. A coolant pump found a groove and refused to let go. The second officer's breath synced to it. Inhale on the offbeat, exhale on. "Stop," Thalen said, to no one, to everyone. The arkship's human turned their head then, as if hearing a thought through 3 layers of hull and 10 layers of training. Their eyes found the camera. Found the Cerithion. Found Thalon. You must be the one who keeps the silence, the human said. That's a good job. Hard, noble, often thankless. Thalon didn't answer. For once, silence didn't feel like a duty. It felt like the most honest response he could give. Here's the part where I'm supposed to reassure you, the human continued softly. Tell you we mean no harm, that we only want to collaborate. But you don't fear harm. Not the kind you can put in a report. You fear losing the shape of yourselves. Lyrics made a small sound. It might have been a yes. The human smiled. Not a weapon, not yet. Music won't erase you. It will add to you, if you let it. Behind them, deeper in the arkship, 1,000 voices stirred. Not singing, not words. The prelude to both. Ceres's console chimed a warning not coded by any Vayari system. Thalon read it and felt his heart find a strange, quick tempo, a count-in sent across every band the fleet could hear. 4 clicks, 1 bar. The High Executor's voice snapped like a snapped string. All ships brace, do not answer, do not respond, hold your fields, hold your... The arkship played the second note. It did not come from a speaker, nor an engine, nor any mouth. It arrived the way dawn arrives, filling the places that cannot hold night any longer. The wreath circle staggered as if a giant had put a gentle hand on its shoulder and whispered, "Remember." The Cerithion's fractures healed where they had not yet formed. Lyrics heard his mother, who had never sung, humming to quiet a fever he had not had. Ceres tasted salt and did not know the word ocean, but understood it perfectly. On the human feed, the diplomat stopped reading the writ. The human closed their eyes. Somewhere deeper still, doors unlocked that had no hinges. Sleepers turned toward waking like flowers toward light. The second note did not end so much as it resolved into silence again. The right kind this time, not brittle, not weaponized. A spacious quiet in which breathing felt permitted. "Now," said the human, eyes open and impossibly kind, "we can talk." The High Executor forgot the script. On what terms? The human cocked their head, listening to something only they could hear. "Tempo," they said again, amused, "and snacks if you've got them." Lyrics dared a breath. "We don't snack." "Then you're about to learn," the human replied brightly. "Diplomacy works best at Andante with something crispy." Thalon didn't laugh, but he wanted to. Not because it was funny, gods it wasn't, but because laughter was a kind of breathing, and he needed both. He turned to his crew. "We proceed," he said, and the words, 3 syllables, ordinary, felt like a new key. Outside, the arkship's red corona cooled toward gold. Inside, a universe took its first step toward time kept not by clocks, but by heart. The Cerithion floated in the dark like a witness too afraid to blink. The crew had tried to restore silence after the second note, but silence was no longer what it had been. It carried weight now, charged like the pause before a storm. Every crystalline body on the bridge shimmered with an unsteady light, their facets trembling with the memory of resonance. And beyond the view panels, the human arkship shifted from slumber to something far more dangerous. It was not a machine powering up, it was a being inhaling. Pods began to open across its interior, first in hesitant sequence, and then in a gathering rhythm, like 1,000 doors clicking open to the same beat. At first the sound was faint, only a whisper of mist escaping into vast corridors. But soon it grew into a tidal presence, a rolling percussion of lids releasing, seals breaking, breath flooding into lungs that had not moved in centuries. What had looked for so long like a silent tomb revealed itself to be an audience chamber, and the audience was waking. Inside, the Vayari diplomatic team staggered in awe. The corridor they had entered was lined with human pods, each one trembling as its occupant stirred. Pale hands pressed against glass, eyes flickered open with the blur of dreams dissolving, and the first voices broke into the air, low and groggy, as though they had only meant to nap through a winter afternoon and found themselves centuries late. A woman rubbed her temples and muttered words that the translators rendered as a complaint about mornings. A man emerged clutching a steaming mug of liquid so black and fragrant that the crystalline observers stepped back in shock, because by every scientific reading the chamber was far too cold to produce such heat. Yet the humans sipped from it without hesitation, grimaced, and whispered something about the machine forgetting his milk. The leader of the delegation tried to compose a greeting, but the words faltered as more humans emerged, some stretching with audible groans, others yawning so widely the sound distorted the microphones. They shuffled barefoot along the floors, hair in wild disarray, robes and fabrics clinging loosely to their half-frozen forms. A child sneezed. An elder rubbed their eyes and muttered that it was far too early. A younger one asked aloud if the Wi-Fi was working. The Vayari delegation transmitted everything back to the executor in a panic, their voices strained and distorted by fear. Yet none of their warnings could diminish the absurdity of what they were witnessing. Not soldiers rising, not conquerors preparing for battle, but millions of grumpy humans awakening as though someone had dared interrupt their weekend rest. Thalen, watching from the Cerithion, pressed his hands together and whispered that they were facing something the archives had never prepared them for. Lyrax, eyes wide and luminous, whispered back that it was not rage they were seeing, but honesty. And honesty was far worse. The humans continued to spill into the corridors in waves, some dragging strange glowing tablets in their hands, others rubbing their stomachs and demanding food. The air filled with the scent of coffee, of heated oils, of something rich and sweet that made the Vayari's crystalline filters ache with confusion. And then, in the largest chamber of the arkship, the truth of what was happening became undeniable. The space was vast, circular, tiered like an arena, every level lined with pods that now opened in rippling succession. From those pods poured the voices of 8 million humans, each one rising in its own key, complaining, laughing, sighing, coughing, and shouting across the tiers with the casualness of a family gathering that had simply overslept. The delegation shivered as the voices clashed because their translators could no longer keep pace, phrases bleeding into one another until the machines sparked in protest. They caught fragments, but the fragments were worse than clarity. Some shouted about being woken before the alarm, others demanded to know who had touched the thermostat. Still others mourned the extinction of foods whose names the Vayari had never heard, but whose absence produced grief like the loss of a world. And when the word pizza echoed across the tiers with a fury that bent the very acoustics of the chamber, the delegation nearly collapsed. The noise grew unbearable, but it was not disorganized. It carried the rhythm of something ancient, something practiced. It was the murmur before a performance, the restless shifting of instruments before the first downbeat. The humans were not chaotic, they were tuning themselves. Thalen recognized it first. His voice shook as he whispered, "They are not simply waking. They are warming up." The leader of the humans appeared again at the center of the arena, robe wrapped loosely, hair a mess, mug in hand like a conductor's baton. They lifted the mug as though calling for attention, and impossibly, the endless noise began to soften. Voices still overlapped, but the overlap carried intent. Breaths aligned. Words fractured into tones. Complaints dissolved into hums. The tears of humanity inhaled together, and the chamber itself seemed to lean forward, waiting for the strike of the baton. The mug came down. A single tone rose. It was not perfect, not refined. Millions of voices cracked, fell sharp or flat, missed entries. Yet the sheer weight of it rolled outward across the void like a tidal wave of raw being. The Cerithion shuddered as its hull absorbed the resonance. The wardships around the arkship flickered as their null fields dissolved like paper in water. Dust clouds spun into curls that resembled clefts and staves, patterns no natural physics could explain. Every Vayari body vibrated with memories they had never lived, laughter they had never earned, griefs they had never suffered. Lyrax pressed his hand to his chest and gasped. "They are tuning the universe itself." Thalen closed his eyes as the sound grew. "No. They are reminding it of its own key." And still the sound grew, stronger and deeper, filling the silence of millennia with the certainty of presence. The galaxy had always feared the day the humans would wake, but no one had imagined they would wake together. Their first act not war or vengeance, but a rehearsal. The law had never been about preventing violence. It had been about preventing music. And now, the concert had begun. The sound lingered long after the human's first tone collapsed back into breath. It wasn't silence that followed, not truly. It was a suspension, the kind of pause a musician writes deliberately into a score, heavy with meaning, charged with expectation. Even the vacuum around the arkship trembled faintly, dust filaments caught in standing waves that shimmered with light no star had produced. On the Cerithion, Thalen leaned heavily on the rail of the bridge. His crystalline frame pulsed erratically, flashes of violet and blue betraying how close he was to resonance fracture. Around him, his crew fought to stay steady. Some pressed their hands flat against the floor, grounding themselves. Others whispered fragments of equations as though mathematics could shield them from melody. But the truth was undeniable. Their bodies remembered the tone more clearly than their minds. Lyrics, still half trembling, broke the silence. It wasn't just noise, it was structure, ratios, intervals, patterns nested inside patterns. Chief, it was... He hesitated, as if the word itself were forbidden. It was language. Before Thalen could respond, the human leader in their absurd robe appeared again on the transmission feed, sipping slowly from the mug, as though the fate of the galaxy weren't hanging by a thread. Their eyes were calm, too calm, and their voice carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what terror they were stirring. "You feel it, don't you?" the human asked softly. "You know deep down it isn't sound. It's instruction. Every note carries a command and the universe obeys." The High Executor interrupted across the shared channel, crystalline edges sharp with fury. "Human entity, by authority of the Silence Writ, you will cease transmission immediately. You will not weaponize." "Weaponize?" the human interrupted, chuckling into their drink. "Oh no. We tried that once long ago. It was boring. The real joy isn't in destroying with music, Executor. It's in rewriting." The words sliced through the fleet like a blade. For a moment, no one dared to breathe. Rewriting meant more than conquest. It meant erasing the very foundations of reality. And then the arkship proved the claim. Its hull pulsed with golden corona again, but this time it wasn't merely light, it was notation. Complex glyphs scrolled across the plating, glowing symbols that no archive recognized, yet every mathematician's mind flinched at their precision. They weren't letters. They were staves, measures, scales. The arkship itself had become a score, and the void around it a page. In response, space bent. A nearby asteroid belt shifted its orbit, not violently but smoothly, slipping into a harmonic spiral. Rocks that had drifted randomly for eons now danced in perfect arcs, each one following the invisible pull of resonance. Gas clouds coalesced into chords, their molecular spin aligning to match unseen signatures. Even light bent differently, colors sliding into gradients that matched the tones humming from the arkship's heart. Lyrics gasped aloud. They're conducting reality. The High Executor's commands turned frantic. Wardships pushed power into dampers, flooding space with counter-resonance. But every attempt only made the harmony richer. Dissonance was swallowed, resolved, rewritten. The humans weren't fighting the interference. They were using it, folding every sound into their composition. And deep within the arkship, more voices joined. Not trained, not refined, but endless. Millions of humans murmuring, humming, whistling, their everyday sounds weaving into the greater resonance. It didn't matter that they were out of tune. The arkship corrected them, pulling every flaw into consonance. For the first time, 8 million imperfect voices created something flawless. The human leader spoke again, though they didn't need to. The sound itself had already said more than words. Still, their voice carried a quiet amusement as if explaining a trick to children. You thought we slept because we were tired, because our planet was ruined, because we needed help. That was a story we left behind for you. A bedtime tale to keep you from peaking. The truth is simpler and worse. We stopped playing for a while because the galaxy wasn't ready for the song. Thalen felt his body dim. Then the writ was written by us. The human finished, smiling faintly. We scattered the warning across the stars. Don't wake the humans. Don't play them music. Don't let them remember the score. We made you guard us against ourselves, and you never realized you were carrying our prank like scripture. A shiver of horror rippled through the Vayari fleet. Generations had upheld the writ as sacred, and now it was nothing but a joke, an elaborate deception crafted by the very beings it was meant to constrain. The humans set their mug down and raised a hand. But now you've played the first note. You've broken the silence. And once a song begins, it doesn't stop. Not until the last measure. The arkships' glow intensified. Pods across its interior now stood wide open, their occupants fully conscious, voices rising not in protest, but in harmony. Children laughed, elders hummed, young ones beat their hands against walls in steady rhythm. It was a choir, not trained, but endless. And with every measure, the universe itself leaned closer, bending to listen. Thylon whispered, not to his crew, not to the executor, but to himself. They were never passengers. They were composers. The thought terrified him. If humans could write chords that realigned matter, if they could bend the orbits of stars with rhythm, if they could teach reality itself to dance, what place was left for order, for law, for silence? The human leader seemed to hear his thought through the feed. Don't be afraid. We're not here to erase you. We're here to invite you. Every species has a sound. Yours is crystalline, sharp, perfect, but lonely. It's time you learned to blend. Lyrics' facets flickered wildly. Chief, what if they're right? What if the galaxy was never meant to be silent? Thalen turned, eyes burning with a fear that bordered on awe. Then everything we've built, every law we've sworn, every silence we've preserved, was just the rest before the music began. And as he spoke, the arkships' resonance deepened. The score expanded outward, not just into the fleet, not just across the system, but into the bones of the galaxy itself. Somewhere, a quasar shifted rhythm. Somewhere else, a black hole pulsed with new light. The humans had awoken and the universe had remembered it was an instrument. The galaxy had prepared for the return of warriors. It had braced for conquerors, for tyrants in flesh reborn. Instead, it received something far worse for its fragile order. Humans in their bathrobes, humming while entire star systems fell into step with the rhythm. The first test came almost immediately. Two species, long at war over a cluster of habitable moons, seized upon the chaos of the awakening to escalate their conflict. Their fleets converged in silence, plasma rails loaded, engines roaring with a promise of annihilation. The Vayari wardships reported the clash in panic, demanding intervention from high command. But before any order could be given, the human arkship shifted its corona, spilling sound into the void. It wasn't an attack. It was jazz. Improvised, uneven, defiant, notes bent sideways, chords that should not have fit yet somehow resolved. The combatants froze. Their ships jittered on scanners, weapons dropping half a frequency, then another, until their engines pulsed in syncopation. Officers screamed orders that were swallowed by trumpets of vibration. When the light cleared, the fleets had not fired. They were swaying. By the end of the encounter, the enemy commanders had dismantled their weapons arrays and were teaching each other rhythm on the hulls of their ships. The Vayari councils called it contamination. The humans called it rehearsal. From there, chaos bloomed. Diplomatic conferences, once stiff and ceremonial, became arenas of improvisation. Ambassadors no longer arrived with binders of agreements, but with instruments, stringed devices grown from wood, brass constructions polished to mirrors, percussion born from whatever they could strike. Alliances were no longer negotiated in words but in sessions, groups of representatives falling into grooves until harmony declared a treaty ratified. One session nearly collapsed into violence when a delegation of crystalline species, rigid and metric, refused to yield to the strange rhythms of humans. But the humans laughed, poured drinks none of the others could metabolize, and suggested a compromise. Karaoke. Songs projected into the void, sung badly, embraced with such joy that even the most rigid species found themselves joining, not out of agreement but because resistance felt lonelier than discord. And so the first interstellar treaty was signed with microphones still echoing, its preamble annotated not with law, but with the words, "Encore pending." The galaxy's militaries fared no better. Ships once designed for precision maneuver and devastating artillery began to falter as humans introduced them to rhythm. Engines calibrated for cold efficiency found themselves humming, thrumming, snapping into tempo against the will of their captains. Formations collapsed into dance, entire squadrons drifting in spirals that made no tactical sense but carried an undeniable aesthetic. On one battlefield, a squadron of dreadnoughts opened fire only to find their plasma bolts dispersing into cascades of sparks shaped like sheet music, their kill shots dissolving into chords no weapon engineer had ever imagined. The dreadnought captains filed complaints with their high command. High command shrugged helplessly. No one could fight against time signatures. And always at the center of this upheaval the humans laughed. They weren't cruel, not in the way tyrants are cruel, but in the way pranksters are cruel, knowing they could undo any sense of order and daring the universe to keep up. They called their chaos jam sessions. The rest of the galaxy called it catastrophe. But catastrophe carried something the galaxy hadn't known in millennia: life. Species that had long hidden behind bureaucracy found themselves pulled into the noise. The Veyari, for all their rigidity, discovered their crystalline bodies carried resonances too complex to ignore. Young ones began experimenting with resonance art, shaping their facets into prisms that split light into chords. The High Executor raged, but the youth only laughed, tapping their bodies into percussion lines, declaring themselves part of the band. Even the dreaded void crawlers, once feared across 10 sectors as predators of silence, found themselves disarmed by melody. Humans introduced them to the concept of hot chocolate and bubble wrap, and their hive mind confessed that most of their menace had been stress. Music softened their edges. They no longer invaded planets. They hosted open mic nights. The change was not contained. It spread. Markets became festivals. Borders became dance floors. What had once been meetings of strategy turned into improvisations where decisions rose and fell on crescendos. Entire cultures discovered parts of themselves they had buried under survival, now coaxed into light by rhythm. For Thalen, the transformation was unbearable to watch and impossible to look away from. Every instinct in his crystalline body screamed that order was collapsing, that the silence his people had preserved was the only thing keeping the galaxy from ruin. And yet, when he heard a group of children from 3 different species singing together in a corridor of the arkship, their voices thin but fearless, he found his facets warming with something like envy. Lyrics, of course, embraced it. He followed the humans wherever he could, recording, learning, humming to himself when he thought no one could hear. "They're not destroying us," he told Thalen one evening. "They're expanding us. We thought silence was safety, but silence was just emptiness. This is dangerous, yes, but it's also alive." Thalen wanted to argue, but when he opened his mouth, no words came. Only a hum, low and reluctant, that slid against Lyrix's voice and created something new. He shut his mouth immediately, ashamed, but Lyrix only smiled. The humans noticed, of course, they noticed everything. The leader in the robe, now sporting a guitar strapped carelessly across their chest, approached Thalen with that maddening half-smile. "You kept the silence for a long time," they said. "That's noble. But even rests are part of music. You were never guarding silence. You were keeping the place for us to come back in." Thalen whispered, "And if we refuse?" The human strummed a single chord that made the deck tremble like laughter. "Then the song will move on without you, but I think you'd miss it." For the first time, Thalen wondered if they were right. Because the galaxy was no longer what it had been. It wasn't an empire of order or a field of silence. It was a concert hall, endless and wild, where even the stars seemed to flicker in rhythm. Wars no longer made sense when a chorus could drown rage faster than any weapon. Politics no longer mattered when karaoke could settle disputes faster than councils. And somewhere in the laughter and noise, Life itself seemed to have remembered a truth it had forgotten, that chaos and beauty were never enemies, but the same melody played at different tempos. And so the galaxy, once terrified of the warning never to wake the humans, now faced a far stranger truth. The humans were awake, and they had no intention of returning to silence. The galaxy had always measured time in the cold mathematics of orbital mechanics, in the precision of rotations and revolutions. Now it measured in rhythm. Fleets traveled not by speed alone, but by cadence. Councils convened not when clocks dictated, but when enough voices gathered in harmony to begin. What had once been silence, tense and orderly, had given way to a vast, unruly, intoxicating performance, and at its center stood the humans, barefoot and smiling, still clutching their mugs of coffee like divine relics. It was not peace. It was something stranger, more unstable, more alive. The Vayari High Executor tried to resist until the very end. Command after command was issued. Silence the frequencies, restrain the resonance, rebuild the wall of order. But the walls did not hold. Their own officers began humming at their stations. Their young danced in corridors when they thought no one was watching. The executor's words rang hollow in a world that now pulsed with melody. Finally, in a last desperate bid, the executor transmitted a demand to the human arkship, voice sharp as shattering glass. Enough. If you must play, then resolve this madness with a single measure. Show us the final chord and let the noise end. The human leader, robe frayed, hair wild, guitar slung lazily across their chest, lifted their mug and grinned. There's no such thing as a final chord. Every ending is just an encore. And with that, they strummed. The chord that rang out was not violent, not thunderous, but vast. It carried warmth and sorrow, humor and defiance, every contradiction wrapped into resonance. It spread across the fleet, across the system, across sectors and spirals, until the whole of known space trembled. Moons altered orbits to form intervals. Nebulae coiled into shapes that resembled ancient instruments. Black holes pulsed in syncopation with quasars. The universe did not collapse under the weight of the sound. It danced. Species that had never spoken found themselves singing together without translation. Predators and prey hummed side by side. The void crawlers, who once terrified entire civilizations, wrapped their limbs in neon scarves and provided bass harmonies so deep that entire stations vibrated like drums. Even the crystalline Vayari, once guardians of silence, discovered their bodies shattered light into symphonies of color that drew crowds across the stars. For Thalen, it was unbearable, and yet it was beautiful. He stood on the bridge of the Cerithion, trembling, knowing he was witnessing the death of the universe he had sworn to preserve. But as the chord swelled and resolved, he felt something stir in his chest, something like laughter, something like grief, something like home. Perhaps silence had never been life. Perhaps it had only been the rest before the music. Beside him, lyrics glowed with joy, facets sparkling like prisms. He had stopped hiding his humming. Now he sang openly, voice clumsy but honest. When Thalen turned to rebuke him, no words came. His own chest betrayed him with a single note, low and reluctant, sliding against Lyrix's until it formed harmony. And in that moment Thalen understood that he had never truly feared the humans. He had feared himself, feared the sound waiting inside him all along. The human leader's voice rolled across the comms, softer now, intimate despite spanning light years. You see, you were never meant to keep the silence forever. You were meant to hold it, to guard it until we return to play. And now, you're part of the band. For days the galaxy sang. Treaties were not signed with ink but with refrains. Disputes ended not with bloodshed but with jam sessions. Armies laid down weapons in exchange for instruments. Entire star systems reorganized themselves into better views, into cleaner harmonics, into arrangements that felt right, even if no mathematician could explain them. The laws of physics bent in places, but no one complained. The universe seemed lighter for it, more willing to breathe. And then, just as abruptly, the humans began to yawn. It started with one or two, leaders rubbing their eyes, children curling up mid-song. Soon, Whole choirs faltered, voices slipping into tired laughter. The arkship dimmed its corona, light softening into twilight hues, and the leader, still clutching their mug though it was empty, stretched with the weariness of a people who had danced too long. The executor seized the moment, desperate, pleading. You cannot stop now. You have undone the order of the galaxy. You cannot leave us like this. The human smiled, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Of course we can. That's the thing about concerts. Eventually, the lights go down, the stage empties, and everyone has to find their own way home. Thalen leaned forward, facets dimming with dread. You mean to sleep again? The human chuckled softly. We always sleep again. You don't play forever. Even the greatest symphony has rests. But don't worry, we've left instructions this time, real ones, not just the old prank about not waking us. They paused, eyes glittering with mischief. Although, maybe keep that rule too, for tradition's sake. Across the arkship, pods began to close once more. Humans settled back into their chambers not with fear or reluctance but with the satisfaction of performers stepping off stage. Their voices faded into hums, hums into whispers, whispers into the deep rhythm of sleep. The galaxy fell quiet again. But this time, the silence was different. It was not the tense, brittle hush of fear. It was the heavy, gentle silence after applause. Thalen stood on the bridge, watching the last lights of the arkship dim. He thought of the writ, of generations who had carried silence like a burden. Now he saw it for what it was, not a prison, not a shield, but a pause. And pauses were not endings. They were invitations. The executor raged, issuing decrees to restore order, to rebuild silence. But no one truly listened. Across the stars, voices still lingered, laughter still echoed, songs still drifted. The galaxy had tasted music. Silence could never be the same again. As the arkship sealed itself, the human leader's voice flickered one last time through the comms, soft as breath, warm as memory. Thank you for keeping the stage ready. We'll be back for the encore. And then they were gone, cocooned in slumber, leaving the galaxy with the weight of their song. For the Veari, for Thalen, for every species that had felt the resonance, the truth was now undeniable. Sometimes the greatest danger was not waking the humans, but letting them fall asleep again.